Next up, we're going to Dublin, where we are delighted to have Danny McCoy, the CEO of Ibec, with us. And this keynote is brought to you by PepsiCo. Danny McCoy has been the Chief Executive Officer of Ibec since 2009. Ibec is Ireland's largest business representative organisation and the country's largest lobbying group. It has 240 staff in 7 locations and has 38 sectoral brands and substantial presence within the European Union through Ibec's Brussels office. Prior to joining Ibec, Danny was a senior economist at both the ESRI and the Central Bank of Ireland in Dublin. He has held lecturing posts at Dublin City University, the University College of London, University of Oxford and Trinity College Dublin. He has been a consultant for the European Commission of the OECD. He's been a member of the Irish National Competitiveness Council, the National Economic and Social Council, the Commission on Taxation and the National Training Agency. He led a European macroeconomic forecasting network for the European Commission of 11 national research institutes. He currently is the President of Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland, Honorary Fellow of the Academy of Engineers, member of the Export Trade Council and the Executive Bureau of Business Europe. His academic work in the early 1990s covered carbon taxation and sustainable development, for which he received an ESR scholarship and the Barrington Medal for researchers under 30. God, he's been busy. This is Danny McCoy.
Hello everybody, my name is Danny McCoy and I'm delighted to join the forum this morning. On behalf of Irish business, it's really great to address you on what are really extraordinary times. Diversity and inclusion is definitely a topic that is now preeminent in the business agenda, because whilst we might be all in this together, we're seeing quite a lot of issues around integration, diversity of experiences and so on being needed for a crisis. So maybe just by way of very quick background on Ibec to start with. Ibec is by far the largest business representative organisation here in Ireland, but actually of its kind, it's one of the largest in Europe. So as the CEO of Ibec, we also have all the concerns that business have. We have 240 staff, 6 locations on the island of Ireland and an office in Brussels. And so from that prism of being the CEO of a relatively large organisation, as well as being the voice of business, I can see that the diversity and inclusion agenda is certainly a topic which many organisations now have identified as a key performance indicator, but it's much more fundamental than that. Because all of us live in a society, all of us want to be integrated. But the nature of stratification in our society, be that on gender or ethnicity, or even on socioeconomic factors, are really a legitimate concern for true business leadership. So I might unpack a little bit on that stratification and maybe say something about the changing nature of our society. So Ibec, as well as being large in a business itself, it represents over 7,500 corporates in Ireland. We've got 38 trade associations, ranging from things like Tech Ireland, Small Firms Association, Biopharma Ireland, and so on. And within that, we have a whole plethora of issues in which to lobby, both here nationally as well as internationally. But through our membership, we have a HR tradition where normally we would see diversity and inclusion sitting within that competency in most organisations. But as I said at the start, I think this is much more fundamental. And I find this is a conversation in the last number of years that's been had at the boardroom table and particularly among the CEOs. So in that stratification idea of Ireland and of the scale of the business community, it might be worthwhile just reflecting through those 38 trade associations where actually diversity and inclusion probably truly lies in our dealing with COVID, dealing with these issues of the economy. So as part of trying to group together the concerns of Irish business, be they international or indigenous, we've been running a campaigns approach. And in that campaigns approach, we cover issues like Ireland, and where it currently finds itself, Ireland, a model of substance. That substance, however, is about being a globalized hub. And within that hub, we need to have a tradition of tolerance, but also of inclusion, respect for people's dignity, but also the integration of more nationalities, but also, while integrating, reflecting the diversity and differentiation that people can bring to work. The model of substance is about the fact that in the last 6 years, we've seen the Irish economy transform in terms of its scale. As measured by GDP, we've experienced over 100% growth, a doubling. Now, people who deny that as a particularly significant factor fail to appreciate that that kind of replication is observable in disposable income growth. Irish households have been on a run rate now of a 6% growth in their disposable incomes for the last 6 years, to a point where incomes in Ireland will double in a 12-year period. We're already halfway through that phenomenon. This gives us a lot of choice, and a lot of choice in how to make the right decisions for the sustainability of our business model. And again, critically, part of that sustainability in a modern, sophisticated society that deals with intangibles, intangible assets as much as tangible assets, will be the issue of diversity and inclusion. Because this will be a key metric on having a society that's dynamic, diverse, and where people will want to work and operate out of. And that's the second campaign we've been doing in Ibec over the last number of years, which is Better Lives, Better Business. And that includes factors like housing, planning, infrastructure, but also the agenda of sustainability. And not a narrow sustainability that is the environment. The environment is actually, and natural resources are just one part of the kind of block that is what business needs to deal with. It's bringing all the various forms of capital together. One form of capital is clearly the natural capital that a lot of people talk about in terms of the green agenda. Significant as it is, it has to be combined with the other forms of capital. We can see that in terms of physical capital, our infrastructure. We can see that in terms of financial capital, in terms of the investment proposition. But as significantly, it also deals with human capital. And it's in that human capital dimension, again, is another kind of slice of how you might look to see where diversity and inclusion comes into the bigger picture. It's the combination of that diversity and inclusion in the human capital element dealing with the other forms that becomes the critical element. Those four elements, or if you like, the four natural predispositions of earth, wind, fire, and water. What's the fifth element? The element that brings all of these things together? Well, that's the entrepreneurial spirit or the enterprise. So the natural place for a society to have diversity and inclusion is to start first actually in the enterprise. And that's why I think it's important for business to seize that initiative. And the more enlightened businesses have been doing that over the last number of years. In the stratification of Better Lives, Better Business, we also have another campaign which is about the future of work. And again, this might seem to be the more natural home for topics of diversity and inclusion. But my point being that it's not actually divorced from those other parts, the model of substance, nor the Better Lives, Better Business. It is more than just the workplace issue. It's not just about, if you like, from an economist perspective, the supply side, getting production right, getting the best talents into your business, getting different ideas, getting people with different life experiences, getting people with different discriminations that they have to deal with, and what they learn from that. It's not just about that in the context of work. It's about the wider dimension on how that spills over into our lives and into the internationalization in the model of substance. So I think that today, when you're discussing diversity and inclusion, it should not be seen as very narrow. In fact, it really should be seen as macro. It's a really macroeconomic issue for businesses. And I think the best business leaders will see it in that context and then try to bring that kind of prism into their business. So it's a multiplicative factor, a bit like all of those earth, wind, fire, and water, and the quintessential, the fifth element being enterprise. It would be really great to see diversity and inclusion as being one of those key enabling factors for the multiplicative aspect. So in other words, don't see it as an add-on. Don't see it as something as an addition into the other things that business do, but see it as part of the multiplicative factor. So in other words, if any of those things go to zero or in a bad way, the whole sum becomes meaningless. And I think that's the best way to actually see this diversity inclusion topic. I could give you a lot of statistics today. I've done a little bit with the macroeconomy. And all of these will be right. What kind of performance enhancements that companies that are enlightened with their diversity and inclusion projects are. But really, again, my central point through this talk is to say that is important. That gives you a kind of a metric on a key performance indicator. And we know the hackneyed term, that which gets measured gets done. But my point is that it's much more significant and much more fundamental in the calculus of a modern progressive society. And Ireland is that. And the question is, in the alignment, can we really say that our diversity and inclusion is sufficient in our society around all the dimensions of diversity, of all the dimensions of inclusion? Not just gender, not just ethnicity, but other aspects about that in terms of what we might have called disability or abilities. So we have a whole raft of issues that we can put forward in a kind of a very large matrix, but the trick will be to get everybody working together. And that's why a forum like this morning, really crucial, that we actually frame it right, that we ask the right questions, but to avoid the danger of actually defining it too narrowly. And if we get that right, I think an expansive view of the agenda of diversity and inclusion forms part of the expansive agenda for the Irish economy and its wider dimensions. It'd be remiss of me in this world that we're living in to say, not say something about the two twin issues that we have to deal with this winter, COVID and Brexit. And again, on both of these, diversity of thought, but in an integration of efforts and personalities will be really crucial, because we're in an age of great uncertainty. The uncertainty, however, means that we have to mobilize people together. And mobilization is about drawing on all of those different strengths, but also having the inclusive unity of purpose. So one of the things we're very fortunate in Ireland is that we're hitting both of these crises at our high watermark. The high watermark is both, we're now 5 million of us as a population in the Republic, but also we're now one of the richest parts of the globe. The combination of that confidence of a larger population and an increasing population is a dynamism in itself, a dynamism that should allow us confidence about the future, and the confidence to know that in order to underpin not just our business, nor just our economy, but our whole society, we need to have a diversity of outlook to actually bring that to its full fruition. The wealth that we have can help us through this winter because we will diversify between sectors. We see this in a reaction to what is core, what is to be kept open, what is the essentiality of our business model. And by essentiality, it doesn't actually give it a primacy. It just means that some things have to stay functioning, the utilities of our lives, the telecommunications, the electricity, the distribution, the groceries, and some things, unfortunately, that involve congregation and integration, effectively, have to be suppressed for some greater good. But we need to identify what that greater good is and what we're actually working towards. And that same issue actually appears on Brexit. Brexit has the potential to be a diversifier, to be pitching sector against sector, people feeling they're being thrown under the bus so one sector can thrive. And that again is a challenge. And the challenge is that if we approach this from a diversity and inclusive variety, or version rather, we will see that there's huge opportunities of integration, not just in the European dimension. It's not about Britain leaving. That's a narrow interpretation. It's how our future relationship with our nearest neighbour now develops. And we've got many things and many palettes, if you like, on which to address this. Between the two islands with the common travel area, that brings us into the human capital element again, and where it locates, and how it can move around, how it can integrate. What strengths can we draw on the fact that there'll be different, diverse populations, diverse markets, even within that both islands market. We have a narrower one in terms of the island itself and the integration of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. This is not a comment on political unification, but what we have observed through COVID is the mingling of our societies, the fact that the border just doesn't exist. That's actually a great thing. I know we're dealing with a pandemic problem, it's suddenly seen as a major constraint, but the corollary of that, it shows that integration, that inclusiveness, the capacity for that diversity between the two jurisdictions, often is painted as a rather negative. It's painted as some kind of arbitrage of buying in one jurisdiction but earning your income in another. It's actually a real sign of the agenda that we have of diversity and inclusion on the island. And so working together, again, we've got this great opportunity. We're dealing with a common problem of lives and livelihoods, and we will succeed in that. But coming out of it, we should be stronger in seeing this idea of being inclusive and respecting the diversities of traditions will make this society much, much stronger. So on that point, I've gone for a much more macro approach to the topic of diversity inclusion, as you can see, but I'd encourage you, those of you who clearly have an interest because you've self-selected to be at this event today, to not see diversity inclusion as too narrow, but see it as actually part of the much bigger tapestry that I hope in the short time I had today to outline. So looking forward to the Q&A, and thank you very much.
Danny, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Amy. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely perfect. Thank you so much for joining us here today virtually. We would have loved to have had you here in person, of course, hopefully next year. Danny, that was really interesting actually, and I think the economics of diversity is a really interesting area, not only from a business perspective, but also from an academic perspective. I think like you said, diversity and inclusion really shouldn't be discussed at almost like it shouldn't be discussed like a narrow topic, almost on a micro level, but really at a macro level. We've had a couple of questions actually come in here live that I'm going to run through.
Okay.
And given the profile of the audience that we have here today, we have a lot of corporates, we have a lot of academia, and this question is a really interesting question actually. So I suppose to kind of set the context, like everything in life, no matter what role you're in, we all have a number. Whether you're in sales, you have a sales target. Whether you're in customer support, you have a key performance indicator. So really, we all have a number. So I'll just read out what the question actually says here. So a decade ago, a Harvard Business Review study said that workplace diversity is one of the most important predictors of business sales revenue, customer numbers, and profitability. I think given what you've just said, I think you'd agree with a lot of that. The findings were staggering. A 1% increase in diversity can lead to as much as a 9% increase in performance. That's amazing. What a return, right? I think at the board level, when you start to talk about return on an investment, that's quite a return. A bigger investment in people and relationships is critical to developing strong companies where people actually want to work. Sure, there's D&I lip service, but very few have actually gone to the degree of changing their actual behavior. Not only to attract and retain diverse talent and employees, but to foster a true culture that welcomes and promotes the inclusion of different people from different backgrounds and experiences within the organization. Many organizations believe they have this, but the results tell a different story. From your perspective, or from an Ibec perspective, Is this a conversation that companies need to have a real metric on, or a key performance indicator on, that they can actually measure it? Like you said, you need to measure it to make it real.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, David. The real issue on the core of that question, I think, is about measurement. And there's a great phrase that you should treasure what you measure, but the corollary of that is clearly that you measure that which you treasure. And we see this from environmental purposes, but given the topic of the day, it's about diversity and inclusion. So those stats really are very compelling. I guess with my economist hat on is that the good start, good start's half the work. You will see those kind of returns. And I think that's why it's beholden on business leaders to actually bring that type of diverse thinking, diverse personalities and so on into the mix. But clearly the success at the end, when you've got true integration, those numbers in terms of that kind of 1% to 9% you mentioned will disappear. And that should be the aim. You should aim to have an integrated where you've got all the best talents, but after a while, if you've gone as we have from decades by suppressing talents, be that in gender or sexual orientation or ethnicity or race or whatever it might be, is that it is compelling to get all those talents. But we should also have the expectation that after a while, by true integration, should be the same as everybody else, and so productivity ultimately will cap out. So there's decreasing returns to scale, but that's not a reason not to do it in the first place. That's actually an argument to do it.
Perfect. No, thank you. And I think you're right. I mean, that return is staggering. So it just tells you, right? Companies that are willing to invest in a true D&I strategy, the return is there to be gained.
Absolutely.
There was a comment that came in that they loved your analogy around the earth, wind, and fire, and that D&I is essentially a strong part of that. Really interesting analogy. So, I suppose lessons learned, right? I think from previous crises, 2007, 2008, the financial crisis. We've seen that D&I at times is put in a back place where it really wasn't a strategic priority for a lot of organisations. While this might have been unintentional, right now companies are focusing. We're in the middle of a crisis. Companies are focusing on the most basic pressing needs for their organisation, for their team members. Urgent measures to adapt new ways of working, consolidating workplace capacities from an infrastructure or real estate perspective, but also trying to maintain employee productivity, maintain that connectiveness, while also maintaining the physical and mental health of their employees. I think this pandemic is different. I think this crisis is different to the financial crisis that we saw in 2008, certainly. D&I certainly seems to be a topic that's at the forefront of business, especially at the board level. For organizations that are really considering what are some of the most key pressing items that they should keep at the top of that agenda, what advice would you give to companies that are considering what are the most pressing needs right now, between that conflict between mental health, the connection with the employees, consolidating facilities, while also trying to keep D&I on the top of the agenda? What advice would you give to companies that are having that types of discussion right now?
Yeah, again, I kind of think of things very slightly in a kind of a mathematical way. Don't mean to be that overly sophisticated. But to your point, I think at the start there, D&I was additive. It was an add-on, in terms of the agenda, and whatever. The environment was an add-on. And I think the enlightened companies realize that it's not additive, it's actually part of the core, it's multiplicative. And if you allow that, multiplier effect that is diversity and inclusion to go down to a low level, obviously in extremis, if it goes to zero, well, it's almost zero. But if you know what I mean, getting down, it's clearly an amplifier if you get it right. And don't see it as an add-on. And I guess that during this crisis, particularly the COVID crisis, we're seeing empathy social empathy becoming much more significant driver of value, or at least perceived value. So corporates that have they're empathetic to their customers or stakeholders, particularly, but to their employees, I think is really important. And one of the shifts that I guess that we're not handling well, even though we all say we are, is, you know, the swing that bring yourself to work, bring your best self to work, which is bring yourself to work. We're now coping with workplace actually coming to visit our home, and can we actually harness that in a way that is itself instrumental to crack the restrictions or the narrowness that we used to have in our workplace, that probably was a culture that was an insider-outsider. And that insider-outsider model, I suppose people with diversity and diverse backgrounds would feel excluded from. Is there an opportunity now that the workplace has been disrupted locationally, and the piece is kind of broken up slightly? That's a big fear for businesses, that their cultures will be broken. But actually, is this a point where the bits are actually scattered now, that in the rebuilding it, you can make sure that diversity and inclusion is actually seen as a multiplicative factor, not the add-ons? There's a huge opportunity here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think from a data perspective, certainly what I'm seeing in industry, when you talk about social empathy and empathy, a lot of corporations are talking about how their data has changed when it comes to key performance indicators such as net promoter scores. I think I might just have lost a little bit of sound.
You lost me. You're back again to me, so apologies. I missed the nub of that question.
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine. From an empathy perspective and from a data perspective, social empathy is a really interesting area, actually. From an industry perspective, certainly what we're seeing, and there's a lot of conversations around how corporates, SMEs have seen almost an uptick in some of their data when it comes to net promoter scores, NPS or CSAT, customer service data. And there certainly seems to be that empathy factor where a lot of customers are grateful for corporations mobilizing their teams, having their teams work from home, but actually keeping the level of service that they're paying for and that they expect really high. And that's being reflected back in a lot of the data that we're seeing in terms of net promoter score and CSAT data. So you're absolutely right. Capturing the data when it comes to social empathy is important, and that's certainly been seen in the reflection on some of the data. So, Danny, last question for you. Cork, Ibec. Certainly, you already have a presence here in Cork. Any updates on anything happening in the Cork area when it comes to Ibec? Anything you want to share with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've plans to move into Penrose dock. We're out in the Douglas Road at the moment, but we've got just signing off on new office space there in that great development John Cleary's doing down there in Penrose. So it's going to be exciting, and I think that's one of the features that we were doing anyhow in advance of kind of COVID. But I think with COVID has actually just amplified the need for spreading the urban footprints of an organization, a national organization like Ibec. And so we'd see Cork as kind of our second HQ, so to speak. And for the dynamism that is in the region has been one of the big leads in the last 10 years around the economic profile that we've seen in the country, giving us the resources nationally as well. So we had hoped to be launching around now and to do that around the same time as the event, but I think we'll see that early in the new year.
Well, we certainly want to capture on the richness of that, and again capitalize on some of the rich talent and the diverse talent that we have in the Cork area. So we look forward to the opening. We will be wishing you luck as you do that. And Danny, I really want to thank you for your time today. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much. And
thanks everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye everyone.
See you, Danny. Bye-bye.